Hello, now this is a comparison I've been wanting to do for ages, basically since I first heard that Aston Martin was going to be using AMG engines. The cars we have here are the new Vantage and an AMG GT, a GT C in this form, and I've got them here today to find out if Aston Martin really has succeeded in the quite considerable challenge of putting its own identity into a shared, effectively, crate engine. Now these are really similar cars, but there's an important distinction to understand from the beginning. They do not share a platform. This is not like the Huracan and the R8. They share the engine. They have a similar fundamental layout, which is that they are front-mid mounted engines with a transaxle gearbox in the rear, linked by a torque tube for a rigid powertrain, and also perfectly centered weight distribution. One of them has a dual clutch gearbox, one of them has an auto, but they are fundamentally in layout, mechanical layout, the same, but as I say, they are completely different cars built by completely different teams. They do, however, sit in a very similar part of the marketplace. They are kind of traditional macho rear-wheel drive V8 engine coupes with a kind of sporting end of the GT spectrum and a quite aggressive and leery personality. In that particular way, they are very similar cars. They also match up well on price. So the Aston Martin is about £120,000, it starts at about £120,000. The GT in GTC form behind me is £130,000. As you see them optioned up, conveniently, they both are £142,000. So very fair comparison in that sense. They're also pretty similar in terms of weight. Aston Martin lists its weight at about 1560 kilos, 1550 I think dry with lightweight options. The Mercedes is 1700 kilos with a driver. So by the time you average it all out, they're about the same, they're comparable. They're a similar size. The Aston Martin's slightly longer in wheelbase and the Mercedes is slightly wider, but they match up very well indeed. What are the differences? Well, they share the same, as I say, 4-litre twin-turbo inside-out layout V8. In the Aston Martin, it's got 510 horsepower and 505 pound-feet of torque. In this particular GT, which is the GTC, I say it's the slightly more powerful one, so it's got 557 horsepower and 501 pound-feet of torque. So similar torque, slightly more horsepower for the Mercedes. It gets that through a slightly lower compression ratio and a little bit more boost, but fundamentally, same engine, similar character, same weight. The Mercedes is 47 front, 50 weight balance. The Aston Martin is a perfect 50-50. That's one of the benefits of using that mid-engined front-mid transaxle layout. A very traditional layout for sporting GTs. It works, it gives it great handling balance and traditional looks as well. So the Mercedes, what are the differences? The Mercedes has a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox. The Aston Martin has an 8-speed automatic. But as I say, they are fundamentally very similar cars doing a very similar job. The big challenge for Aston Martin is to make the Vantage stand out as something different from the GT. And of course, something better. Is it? Let's go and find out. So let's start with the AMG, given that this is kind of the benchmark Aston Martin has to measure itself by in order to make the Vantage a proper Aston Martin. And I really like the GT. I know not everybody does. It's weird. It seems to leave a few people cold. Some people don't like the looks of it. Some people don't like the way it drives. But I've driven a few over the time it's been on sale. I think I've driven most of the different variants and I quite like them. I think it's a more conservative looking car, but when you see one on the road, it actually has proper presence. They look really wide and flat and squat, and I quite like the kind of unabashed, old-fashioned muscle car thing, and that's obviously very in keeping with AMG's persona, isn't it? And the engine is mega. As we know, we've driven this engine in its various different forms in all sorts of AMGs recently, but it always impresses. And yes, you can tell it's turbocharged because there is just that little bit of softness in the pedal and a kind of rush of boost and the kind of torque you never had in the old naturally aspirated engines. But it's pretty much as good as they come in terms of the kind of new school turbo engine. It sounds fabulous. It does sound really, really good. I know it's a bit contrived, but outside at tick over it sounds angry, inside the car it sounds angry, and it's just a proper car. And that kind of macho soundtrack is matched with the driving manners. Now, what are the differences between this and the Aston Martin? As I say, they've got a fundamentally similar layout, they've got the same engine, but in all other respects they are totally different cars. And the AMG has hydraulic steering, which is interesting, with a mechanically variable rack, and in this GT C version it's got rear wheel steering too, and the wider rear bodywork and wider rear track, and it has a dual clutch gearbox as opposed to the Aston Martin's automatic, and quite a different character, I think. The engine has got a kind of, it's got a different tone, I think, and it's got a slightly different character because in this tune, in the 557 horsepower specification for this GTC, it's kind of a bit more boosted. It relies on its turbocharging a bit more heavily, so it actually makes some quite interesting noises from the outside. You get some kind of turbo gurgles and whooshes and gargles and stuff. It sounds pretty cool, I think. And it feels a little bit more boosty than the regular GT, the GTS, for instance. Like all GTs, it's actually geared up for traction. Now, the old SLS and old AMGs with mechanical diffs were all pretty traditional in their handling balance, shall we say, but I remember noticing this when I first drove the GT. It's got this, or at least in S and above, it's got an active electronic rear diff, so that means it can open and close and do all sorts of clever stuff, work with the stability control, all those things. And AMG has kind of matured a bit, and it's made this car more about grip, less about the old kind of tail happy antics that we used to enjoy in old AMGs. So it's got a more sophisticated character, and you combine that with the funky steering setup, and the steering feels a bit odd. It's kind of light, and because of the rear wheel steering, there's a kind of, some people do four wheel steering better than others, and I'm not sure this is one of the best. In a Porsche, for instance, like a GTS, Carrera 2 GTS, which would be a good comparison with these two cars, it's actually quite hard to tell when it's got four wheel steering. It's that well integrated. In fact, one journalist colleague of mine, who shall remain nameless, jumped out of a Carrera enthusing wildly about how nimble the four-wheel steering made it feel, when in fact he'd been driving a standard one without four-wheel steering. That's how well integrated the system is in Porsche. In the Mercedes, it has this, I don't know what it's like a time delay or something like that, but you put a steering input in, and then the car kind of follows it round. So it's a kind of, it's like you are oversteering into a corner, not in the cool way, as in you're putting too much steering in, because you put in as much as you think you might need through the wheel, and the front goes, and then all of a sudden the back kind of starts to steer as well. So you kind of find yourself almost winding lock off mid-corner, which is a slightly peculiar sensation. You kind of get used to it, and you get used to just not putting such big inputs in, and the car does actually flow quite nicely when you do that. And yeah, you get used to it, but it never stops feeling a little bit strange. So that's a definite character trait of this car. Another one is the gearbox, which is pretty good, pretty crisp. Some of them I've driven that do this weird kind of multiple downshift thing. This one doesn't seem to do it, which is good. That's a relief. Suspension. Now, it's not a particularly comfortable car. It's called a GT, but it's pretty firm. I'm in first stage of the sports damping now. There's three. There's Comfort, Sports, Sports Plus. But it's pretty burly in all of them. And it's different from the Aston. I'll talk more about that when I get into the Aston. But in that German way, it's kind of set up to get back to a settled state as quickly as possible. So it's very nailed down. It doesn't move around much. It corners really flat. And it feels quite harsh in quite a lot of situations. The damping's good and the spring rates are well matched, so it doesn't get pinged around the road like perhaps an M3 or an M4, but it's quite uncomfortable. It's quite harsh given it's meant to be a GT car, but then it is at the sportier end of the spectrum and it is at the sportier end of the AMG GT range, so perhaps that's to be expected. This is of course one step down from the GTR. And the other thing it suffers from quite badly is tyre noise. That's just one of those quite wearing things when you're on a long journey. You know, it sounds silly to be fussing about refinements, things like that in a car like this, but it's the kind of thing that does get you down on a long journey. I like the interior. I think it's quite stylish. I think it's probably better made than the Aston Martins as well, or better put together anyway. And it's a nicer place to be, I think, overall. So it sets quite a high standard there. You can't see very much out of it, but then that's always been a problem with the SLS and the GT. So it's quite difficult to place on the road, more so because it's really, really wide. I'm on a quite narrow B road now and it does take up a lot of space, but it is a really fast, thrilling and charismatic car. And I think that last thing is very important, and that's the bit that Aston Martin is going to really have to beat with the Vantage, and it's going to be one of the trickier things to nail. So that is the AMG GT. Probably time to swap to the Aston and see what that's like. Right, so to the Aston Martin, how is it different from the AMG? Well, it's quite noisy, as you'll have noticed. I think that's an interesting opening gambit from the Aston Martin. I've driven this car before, briefly on track, and to be honest, at that point, it seemed to me almost too noisy. I know, strange thing to say, but there we go. Almost seemed a bit too much, a bit too try-hard in a way, but there it is. What else do we notice? Well, the interior is pretty familiar, isn't it? There's lots of similar looking switchgear, and that is no great surprise. That is because, along with the engine deal, Aston Martin also shares all the Mercedes infotainment stuff. So a lot of the switches and main interfaces are very similar. They've been laid out in a different way. I'm not quite so sure about the cabin. It's a bit leery. It's a bit kind of, don't know. It's not as elegant as older Aston Martins. It's a lot more, works a lot better thanks to that Mercedes kit, but I'm not quite sure about the look of it all, and it's very kind of fussy, quite button heavy. It's quite old-fashioned in that sense, but anyway, everyone will have their own opinions about that. I've got my own about this square steering wheel as well. I'm not sure about that. I do hope it's optional, but at least given the nature of the way it drives, you don't have to move your hands around it too much. So there's some small comfort there at least. So that's the interior. There's probably more interesting stuff to talk about, isn't there, about how differently they drive, or do they drive differently at all? Well, let's start with the engine, because that is the thing that's the same. Aston Martin's definitely, as I say, made it sound different. If you've driven older Aston Martins, the naturally aspirated era, you'll recognise the sound, and that's no mean achievement, given it's a whole new engine from a whole new supplier, it's turbocharged, all the rest of it, so that's impressive. And as in AMG, it is, for a new school turbocharged engine, a really, really impressive unit. I think, say what you like about the idea of Aston Martin buying in crate engines, if you're going to do that, it may as well be the best one in the business. And I think this AMG V8 is absolutely stellar. I mean, it's a really, really great engine, and I don't think you're going to get fixated about, oh, well, it's an AMG cast off. It's not really an issue once you get driving it. Yes, it's kind of the hook for this car, but it doesn't really enter into your mind. There are more important differences. I think this car has been set up very differently from the GT. Now, I was saying in that car that it corners very flat, and it's in that German way, very keen to kind of get back to its settled state. Now, the guy who set this car up is Matt Becker, who some of you may know used to work at Lotus, and he has got a fantastic understanding of how to make cars flow in that way that a lot of British manufacturers do. And there are little things he does, little kind of quirks, like, I've talked to him before about this, and he's very into things like the amount of roll in the car should correspond to how much steering lock you're putting in, which sounds like a kind of minor detail, but what it means is that as you're turning into a corner and the car's rolling, you have a kind of an instinctive understanding of what the car is doing, what the chassis is doing, how the tyres are loading, things like that. And there is, although it's a pretty stiff car overall, there is more roll in the Aston Martin. It does kind of flow, and you get more sense of the weight shifts in this car than you do in the AMG, and that makes it a bit more intuitive to drive, a bit more enriching, I suppose, more interesting, because you're getting more feedback from what the chassis is doing, and it's nice feedback as well. It's not wallowing about all over the place by any means, but it's kind of flowing with the road. I'm going to come across all pretentious road tester here, but whereas the Mercedes wants to get back to its settled state, in this car it's happy in its kind of transient motion. So when the dampers are kind of mid-stroke, when you're kind of floating over a bump or whatever, the car feels happy in that state and still on your side. It doesn't feel unsettled. It feels entirely natural, and that's just really nice on a typical English B road. So that's important. The steering is different as well. Now, Aston Martin has actually gone to electric power steering, which keyboard warriors will tell you is the death of steering feel. Now, interesting comparison, because the Mercedes has hydraulic steering and four-wheel steering and all the rest of it as well. Actually, I think the Aston Martin steering feels better than the AMGs. I was saying that the AMGs feels a little bit weird. It's kind of got, because you're fighting with the four-wheel steering system and a load of other bits and bobs too. The Aston Martin actually feels a bit more natural. It's got I think a linear rack. It's certainly got a quick rack, and the way it's been tuned just feels a bit more natural. Another thing, these big gear shift pedals, and this is interesting because we've got an automatic gearbox here, haven't we? Not a dual clutch like the Mercedes. And again, you might expect that to be a bit more sluggish than the dual clutch, but actually no. Sometimes it slurs the downshifts a little bit more than you'd want, but I actually think it possibly reacts even better than the Mercedes one. And these big gear shift paddles, it's a minor thing. It's just a switch, really, isn't it? But the fact they're big and they've got a decisive movement in them, it just connects you to the car that bit more and makes the driving experience a bit more involved, which is what you want out of a car like this, isn't it? This is meant to be the sportier car in the Aston Martin range. It's meant to be an alternative to 911s and things like that, and there are these little touches like that that just make you feel more engaged with the car. So really cool things. And I think, yes, I think Aston Martin has been successful in putting some of its own character into this car. And I think that's pretty impressive, given that apparently the engine spec is kind of locked down. They don't get to play too much with that. So really they're only tweaking things like throttle calibration, details like that. Another similarity with the Mercedes is that the Aston Martin has a fully active diff as well. This is kind of new technology for Aston Martin, because they usually use a more old school mechanical one. So that again gives Matt Becker and his team a lot more to play with when they're setting up the handling of the car. But overall, although they are similar in weight distribution, they've got the same engine, as I may have mentioned once or twice, and a lot of kind of fundamental similarities in character. The kind of final tuning of this car is where Aston Martin needed to, and I think has been successful in putting its own character into the car. So it's very tough to call between these two. I like them both. There's no bad choice, and it's going to come down to charisma, something I mentioned in the AMG piece. And that's important in these cars, because they are kind of special cars. They're cars that are there to make you feel good about yourself and have a bit of fun with. And the Mercedes does that, the Aston Martin does that, and it's really going to be down to which one you prefer, which character you prefer. For me, and I speak as a die-hard AMG fan and a fan of the GT, actually, I think the car that speaks to me as a kind of driving enthusiast more clearly is the Aston Martin. So it's a very, very tight call, very, very tough decision to make. But if it's going to be one or the other, for me, it's going to be the Vantage.